The scent of cedar and sawdust, the smell of my entire life, filled the workshop. I was triple-checking the measurements on a complex blueprint when my daughter-in-law, Megan, leaned over my shoulder, her expensive perfume a sharp intrusion. "It's not like it's a real job, Eleanor," she sighed, waving a dismissive manicured hand over the plans. "How long can it possibly take to whip up some kitchen cabinets for us? It's just a hobby. Just a hobby. 40 years of skill, thousands of hours of dedication, the legacy my late husband left me, all dismissed in a single breath." She saw a cute, free labor gimmick for her design blog, not the master craftswoman I am. But that casual insult wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment I finally realized the foundation of our family was rotten. To understand how we got there, you have to go back 3 weeks. To understand how we got there, you have to go back 3 weeks. It all started, as these things often do, not with a demand, but with a voice dripping with so much sugar you could feel your teeth ache. Megan called me, her tone giddy, like a teenager who'd just been asked to prom. "Eleanor, you will not believe the news. Are you sitting down? You should be sitting down." I was, in fact, standing at my workbench, the one my husband Frank built for me before he passed. My hands were covered in a fine layer of sawdust, and I was trying to get the tension just right on my bandsaw. "I'm fine, Megan. What's all the excitement?" "Okay, so you know that design blog I follow, Hearth and Home? The one with like 200,000 followers? Well, the editor, Brianna, saw my latest Instagram post, the one with the reclaimed barn door I staged in our dining room, and she is obsessed with my aesthetic. She wants to do a full feature on our kitchen renovation. A full feature, Eleanor, this is it. This is the break I've been waiting for. I could picture her perfectly, pacing her spotless gray and white living room, one hand waving in the air, the other clutching her phone like a winning lottery ticket. You know the type. Everything is an aesthetic. Every moment is a potential piece of content. "That's wonderful, honey. I'm happy for you." And I was. In that moment, I genuinely was. My son, David, had married her 5 years ago, and while she and I were different as night and day, I wanted my son to be happy. "Here's the thing, though," she continued, her voice lowering into a conspiratorial whisper. "The whole feature, the entire vibe, depends on one thing. It needs to feel authentic, handcrafted. You know, a story. And that's where you come in. David and I want to come over. Can we pop by in an hour? We have to show you the vision." An hour later, they were standing in my workshop. David, my sweet, gentle son, looked a little sheepish, shuffling his feet like he did when he was 10 and had broken a neighbor's window. Megan, on the other hand, swept in like she was scouting a location. She ran a perfectly manicured finger over a stack of rough-cut maple, careful not to get a splinter. "This place is just so charming," she said, looking around at the tools hanging in their perfect order on the pegboard walls, the stacks of lumber Frank and I had collected over the years, the faint, sweet smell of wood and oil that I considered my own personal potpourri. "It has such great bones." She was talking about my life sanctuary like it was a fixer-upper. She unrolled a large poster board on Frank's workbench, right over the spot where his initials were burned into the wood. On it were dozens of pictures torn from magazines, white oak, shaker-style doors, a massive island with intricate paneling. It was a beautiful kitchen. It was also a monstrous amount of work. "So," Megan began, tapping a picture of a flawless kitchen that probably cost more than my first house. "The blog is calling the feature Modern Roots. The whole angle is about blending new design with family tradition." And I was thinking, what could be more traditional than having my husband's incredibly talented mother handcraft our cabinets? The story is just perfect. Can you imagine the caption? "These aren't just cabinets, they're a legacy, built by the hands that raised my husband." She looked at me, her eyes wide and hopeful. She was selling me a story, and I was the unpaid main character. David finally spoke up. "Mom, we know it's a lot to ask." He wouldn't look me in the eye. He was looking at the floor, at the sawdust from my morning's work. "But Megan's right. No one can do this like you. The quality you get from a big box store, it's just not the same. We want something that will last, something with meaning." I looked at the plans. The upper cabinets, the lowers, the pantry units, the massive centerpiece island. It was hundreds of hours of work, planning, measuring, cutting, joining, sanding, finishing. It was a 3-month job, easy, for a professional crew. Megan, this is a beautiful design, I said slowly, choosing my words with care, but a project of this scale, the timeline is very tight. Oh, I know, she chirped. That's the crazy part. Brianna wants to do the photo shoot in 3 weeks. 3! Can you believe the turnaround? It's a whirlwind, but that's how the industry works. 3 weeks, I almost laughed. It was an impossible deadline, an insult to the craft itself. It wasn't a request, it was a demand, wrapped in a compliment. They weren't asking for my help. They were commissioning a miracle. I felt a familiar pressure building in my chest. It was the pressure to be the good mother, the helpful mother-in-law, the one who always said yes, the one who kept the peace. I looked at my son. He finally met my gaze, and in his eyes I saw the silent plea. Please, Mom, just do this. It will make my life easier. He was a good man, my David, but he hated conflict more than anything. He would rather I move a mountain than he have an uncomfortable conversation with his wife. I don't know, David, I said, my voice softer than I intended. I ran my hand over the edge of Frank's workbench, feeling the smooth, worn wood beneath my palm. This bench had been my partner for the last 10 years since I lost him. It had seen me through grief, loneliness, and the joy of creation. It was a sacred space, and right now, it felt like it was being auctioned off. Megan put her hand on my arm. Her touch was light, airy. Eleanor, think of it. Your work, your legacy, featured in Hearth and Home. People will see what a true artist you are. This isn't just for us. It's for you, too. It's the kind of recognition you deserve. That was the line that did it. The patronizing little pat on the head. The suggestion that my 40 years of honing a difficult, beautiful craft needed her blog for validation. That my legacy, which was written in every solid piece of furniture in my son's home, needed to be approved by an influencer named Brianna. But I looked at David's face, and my resolve crumbled. I saw the boy who used to bring me his broken toys with tear-filled eyes, believing I could fix anything, and like a fool, I still wanted to be that woman for him. Okay, I heard myself say. The word felt foreign in my mouth. Okay, I'll do it. Megan squealed and threw her arms around me in a hug that felt more like a business transaction closing. Oh, thank you, Eleanor. You are a lifesaver. You won't regret this. David gave me a relieved smile and a quick hug. Thanks, Mom. You're the best. As they left, chattering excitedly about paint colors and hardware finishes, I stood alone in the sudden silence of my workshop. The only sound was the low hum of the dehumidifier in the corner. I rolled up Megan's vision board and set it aside. I walked over to my lumber rack, running my hand over a magnificent slab of walnut I'd been saving for a special project. A project for me. I looked at my hands, calloused and strong, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a cold knot of resentment tighten in my stomach. I had just promised away the next 3 weeks of my life, my time, my skill, my peace, and I hadn't even talked about the cost of the wood. It was clear they hadn't even considered it. They just assumed I'd handle it, because that's what I always did. I handled it. I smoothed things over. I was the reliable, sturdy, old oak tree in the middle of the family, the one everyone could count on to still be there, rain or shine, asking for nothing in return. That night, I couldn't sleep. The quiet of the house felt different, not peaceful, but heavy. At 2 a.m, I gave up, put on my worn flannel robe, and padded out to the workshop. I flipped on the single overhead lamp, the one directly above Frank's workbench. The rest of the large space remained in soft shadows, a silent congregation of saws, drills, and clamps waiting for a command. This was my church. This was my home, more than the house itself. I ran my hand over the thick butcher block surface of the bench. It was a map of our life together. There was the deep gouge from 2005 when I let a chisel slip while carving a toy train for David's son, my grandson, Jack. A faint, dark ring marked the spot where Frank always set his mug of coffee, every Saturday morning for 30 years. And there, right on the corner, almost faded from view, were his initials FM, burned into the wood with a soldering iron when he was just a boy himself, working alongside his own father. My fingers traced the letters. He was so proud of this bench. He'd built it from a single fallen oak tree on his grandfather's farm. Good wood has a memory, Elle, he used to say. It remembers the sun and the rain, the wind in its branches. You just have to be quiet enough to listen to its story. I leaned against the bench, the worn wood cool against my cheek, and for a moment I could almost smell his scent, a mix of cedar shavings and Old Spice aftershave. It was so real, so close, that my eyes burned with sudden tears. I closed them, and the memory came flooding back, as clear as if it were yesterday. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, maybe 25 years ago. David was at a friend's house, and the workshop was bathed in golden light. I was struggling, trying to master a dovetail joint. My cuts were clumsy, the fit was loose, and I was getting frustrated, ready to throw the piece of pine across the room. Frank came up behind me, his large, warm hands gently covering mine. He didn't say, "You're doing it wrong." He never did. He just guided me. "Easy now." His voice was a low rumble, close to my ear. "You're fighting the wood. Stop trying to force it. Feel the grain. It'll tell you which way it wants to go." He guided my hands, holding the chisel at the perfect angle, showing me how to tap it gently, letting the tool do the work. The wood shaved away in a perfect, fragrant curl. When we fit the two pieces together, they slid into place with a snug, satisfying sigh. A perfect joint. I had turned to him, beaming. "I did it." He smiled. That slow, easy smile that always made my heart feel like it was coming home. He picked up a piece of scrap wood and a pencil. "It's not just wood, Elle," he said, his voice soft but sure. "It's a story. Every joint, every seam, every coat of finish is a word in that story. You're the author. Make it a good one." The memory faded, leaving an ache in its place. Make it a good one. What story was I telling now? The story of a woman who let her own son and his ambitious wife turn her sanctuary into a sweatshop. The story of a craftsman whose life's work was reduced to a charming prop for an Instagram post. Frank would be furious. Not loud, table-pounding furious. That wasn't his way. He'd be quiet. A deep, rumbling quiet that was far more intimidating. He would have looked at David with those disappointed eyes and said, "Your mother's time is the most valuable thing she has, son. Don't you dare waste it. And don't you dare let anyone else treat it like it's free." I stood up straight and took a deep breath, the air thick with the ghosts of 1,000 projects. I looked at Megan's vision board, still leaning against a stack of cherry wood. "Modern roots," it said. What a joke. They didn't want roots. They wanted the appearance of roots. They wanted the beautiful, strong, old tree, but they wanted to chop it down and rearrange the pieces to fit their perfect, sterile, white and gray living room. I walked over to the board and studied the intricate designs. The work was complex, demanding precision and patience, two things a 3-week deadline actively fought against. It would require the best of my skill and all of my energy. It would mean long days and sleepless nights. It would mean putting my own projects, my own joy, on hold. And they didn't even see it. They didn't see the art or the effort. They just saw a shortcut, a freebie, a clever little narrative for a blog. I picked up a block of maple, its surface smooth and cool, its weight solid and honest in my hands. This wood deserved better. Frank's memory deserved better. I deserved better. But I had given my word. A promise was a promise, and I had always been a woman who kept hers. So, with a heavy heart and a mind already calculating grain patterns and cut lists, I walked over to the main power switch. I flipped it on. The old fluorescent lights hummed to life, casting a stark, uncompromising light over everything. The quiet church was now a factory. And the first shift of my 3-week sentence was about to begin. The first shift of my 3-week sentence had begun, and it quickly bled into the second and the third. Days became a blur of the high-pitched scream of the table saw, the rhythmic thump of the planer, and the constant vibrating hum of the dust collector. I'd start before the sun was up, a cup of coffee growing cold on Frank's workbench, and I'd work until my back ached and my hands were too stiff to make a fist. The fine, pale dust of white oak settled on everything, my hair, my glasses, the lines around my eyes. It got into my coffee and my lungs. It was the physical cost of my promise, paid in sweat and exhaustion. By day 4, I hit the inevitable wall. Megan's vision called for an enormous amount of quarter-sawn white oak, a specific cut that gives the wood a beautiful, straight grain. It's also incredibly expensive. The small stash I had was gone in 2 days. The rest of my lumber, the walnut, The cherry, the maple I'd lovingly collected, wasn't right. It wouldn't fit her aesthetic. There was no way around it. I had to go buy the materials myself. There's a particular kind of indignity in pushing a giant orange flatbed cart through Costco on a Tuesday morning, not for a bulk supply of paper towels, but for a stack of premium hardwood. I navigated past mountains of muffins and flat-screen TVs to the lumber section, a small, often ignored corner of the massive warehouse. The oak was beautiful, I had to admit, creamy, straight-grained, and perfect. It was also priced like it was gold-plated. I did the math on a scrap of paper, my pencil scratching over the numbers. Board feet, thickness, waste allowance, my stomach tightened. To build their dream kitchen, the raw materials alone would cost more than $2,000. $2,000 from a retirement fund that Frank and I had painstakingly built over 40 years. Money that was meant for a new roof, or maybe that trip to see the autumn colors in Vermont we'd always talked about. I stood there for a long time, staring at the lumber. I could call David. I could tell him the cost and ask him to pay for it. A professional certainly would. But the thought of it made me feel sick. It would lead to a conversation. Megan would get involved. She'd probably suggest a cheaper wood, a compromise that would still fall on me to execute, and I'd be cast as the difficult one, the one not committed to the vision. It was easier, as always, just to handle it. So, I loaded the heavy planks onto the cart myself, my muscles groaning in protest. At the checkout, the cashier, a young woman with pink hair, looked at the lumber, then at me, then at the staggering number on the screen. $2,547.18, she said, her voice full of surprise. I just nodded and slid my debit card into the machine, feeling a piece of my independence chip away with the electronic beep. As I was maneuvering the heavy cart through the crowded parking lot, my phone rang. It was David. "Hey, Mom. How's it going?" he asked, his voice cheerful and distant. I could hear the faint click-clack of a keyboard in the background. He was at his accounting firm, in his clean, quiet, air-conditioned world. "I'm all right, honey. Just running some errands," I said, leaning against the cart to catch my breath. "Oh, yeah? Where are you?" "Costco," I said, looking at the mountain of wood I now had to somehow get into my truck. "I'm just picking up the oak for your kitchen." There was a pause. "Oh, wow. Cool. I didn't even know they sold wood there," he said, his tone one of mild, detached curiosity, as if I'd told him I'd found a new brand of cereal. "Hey, listen, while I have you, can you check if they have those big bags of pistachios? Megan's obsessed with them. We're all out." The request was so small, so thoughtless, so utterly oblivious that for a second, I couldn't breathe. He wasn't a bad person. That was the tragedy of it. He was just a boy who had grown into a man who had outsourced his conscience to his mother for so long, he'd forgotten he was supposed to have one of his own. "I'm already checked out, David," I said, my voice flat. "Oh, no worries. Don't make a special trip or anything," he said breezily. Then he added the line that broke something deep inside me. "Let me know when you get home. If I can get away from the office, I can swing by and help you carry all that in." Help me carry it in. The magnanimous offer of 10 minutes of manual labor for a project I was funding with my retirement and building with my body and soul. The sheer, staggering blindness of it stole my breath. He didn't ask what it cost. He didn't ask if it was too heavy. He just saw a task he could delegate, a problem that was already being solved by someone else. By me. "That's okay, David. I'll manage," I said. And my voice was so cold, so devoid of warmth, that for the first time, he seemed to notice. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound tired." "I am tired," I said. "I have to go. Goodbye." I hung up before he could answer. I stood there in the middle of the chaotic Costco parking lot, car horns honking around me, the sun beating down on my face. I looked at the receipt in my trembling hand, a flimsy, thermal paper monument to my own foolishness. This wasn't a gift. A gift is given freely, and it is received with gratitude. This was an extraction. They were mining me for my time, my money, and my love, and they weren't even bothering to thank the mountain for its ore. And yet, the very next day, the mountain went back to work. I was up at dawn, my body a geography of aches I hadn't known existed. The project was entering the most grueling phase, sanding. Endless, mind-numbing, soul-destroying sanding. For 2 days, my world was reduced to the high-pitched whine of the orbital sander and the feeling of grit under my fingernails. I moved from piece to piece, transforming the raw cut wood into surfaces as smooth as silk, my arms vibrating long after I'd shut the tool off. It was meticulous, meditative work that usually brought me peace. Now, it just felt like punishment. My workshop, once a sanctuary, had become a prison of my own making. I was working on one of the large panels for the pantry, the sander buzzing in my hand, when I heard Megan's voice slice through the noise. It was coming from the backyard, just beyond the open workshop doors. I clicked the sander off, the sudden silence making my ears ring. I thought she was calling for me. "No, I told you it's going to be fabulous." Her voice was bright, performative. "Brianna from the blog is going to eat it up." I wiped a trickle of sweat from my forehead with the back of my dusty hand and stepped closer to the door, ready to answer. But then I heard another voice, tinny and distant. Megan was on speakerphone. I froze. You know that feeling you get when you realize you're about to hear something you shouldn't? A hot, prickling shame, even though you've done nothing wrong? I should have turned the sander back on. I should have walked away. I didn't. "I still can't believe you got her to do it on such short notice," the other voice said. It was her sister, Chloe. Aunt Carol paid a fortune for her custom closets last year. Megan let out a sharp, theatrical laugh. "Oh, please, that's the beauty of it. The blog is going to eat up the whole sentimental old mom builds kitchen angle. It's so authentic. She thinks it's a gift, but honestly, it's just free artisan labor." The air in the workshop seemed to go thin and cold. I gripped the edge of the workbench, my knuckles turning white. Frank's initials dug into my palm. "Are you serious?" Chloe asked, a note of admiration in her voice. "What would that have cost you guys, for real?" "I got a quote from a custom shop in the city, just for kicks," Megan said, her voice dropping into a proud, conspiratorial tone. $22,000, and that was with a 6-month waiting list. This saves us 20 grand and gives me a killer backstory for the feature. I mean, content is content, right? Content is content. My life's passion, my husband's legacy, the calluses on my hands, the ache in my spine, the thousands of dollars I just spent from my own savings, all of it reduced to a hashtag, to content. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to lean against a stack of wood to keep from falling. I couldn't move. I could only stand there, hidden in the shadows of my own workshop, and listen. Chloe giggled. "You are a genius, Meg. An evil, evil genius. David is so lucky he married you." "He has no idea," Megan agreed smugly. "He just thinks I'm honoring his mom. It's perfect. The only tricky part is going to be the photo shoot itself." "What do you mean?" "Well," Megan said, and I could hear the smirk in her voice, "I obviously need to get a few shots of her in her element for the blog post. You know, for the backstory. But I'll have to style them carefully. Just make sure she's not in the actual photos of the finished kitchen." "Why not?" "Oh, come on, Chloe," Megan sighed, her voice laced with pity for her sister's ignorance. "Let's be real. Wrinkled hands don't really fit my brand's aesthetic." That was it. That was the sentence. The one that echoed in the sudden roaring silence of my own mind. I looked down at my hands. They weren't beautiful, not in the way Megan's were. They were instruments. The nails were short and clean, but the knuckles were swollen with a touch of arthritis. There were small silvery scars from a slip of a chisel here, a burn from a soldering iron there. They were the hands that had held my husband's as he passed. They had changed my son's diapers, baked his birthday cakes, and built the very crib he slept in. They had measured, cut, and shaped every solid piece of wood in his home. And they were an inconvenient truth in his wife's perfect, curated lie. I didn't make a sound. I simply stood there as the dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon sun. The betrayal was so complete, so breathtakingly cruel, that it went past pain and landed somewhere else. It landed in a place of cold, hard clarity. The knot of resentment I'd been carrying for weeks didn't loosen. It solidified into a diamond. Hard, unbreakable. Megan wanted a story, a killer backstory. I picked up the heavy sanding block from the workbench, feeling its solid weight in my palm. My hands, my wrinkled, capable, story-filled hands. All right, I thought, a strange calm settling over me. She wants a story. I'll give her one. Just not the one she's writing. The one she'll be telling for the rest of her life. That evening, I didn't go back into the house right away. The sun had set, and the workshop was filled with long, deep shadows. The anger that had been a roaring fire in my chest had burned down to embers, leaving behind a kind of profound, cold calm. The path forward was suddenly, startlingly clear. First, I cleaned. I swept up every last particle of the white oak dust, the dust of their project, until the concrete floor was bare. I wiped down every surface of my table saw, my planer, my jointer. I was reclaiming my space, performing a quiet exorcism of their entitlement. Then, I walked over to Frank's workbench. Megan's vision board was still propped up against the wall. I took it, rolled it up into a tight tube, and secured it with a rubber band. I didn't rip it or crush it. I simply slid it into a dusty corner behind a stack of old woodworking magazines. Out of sight, out of my soul. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. This wasn't an act of rage, it was an act of correction, a balancing of the scales. From a heavy, locked, flat file cabinet under the workbench, a cabinet that held only our most treasured plans, I pulled out a large, rolled-up piece of vellum, yellowed with age. It felt warm and alive in my hands. I carefully unrolled it on the now clean surface of the bench, weighting the corners with small blocks of polished brass. It was the blueprint for the mariner's chest. It was a project Frank had designed decades ago but never found the time to build. It was his masterpiece. The design was breathtakingly complex. Hand-cut dovetail joints, intricate brass inlay work depicting a compass rose, secret compartments, and a hand-carved lid that looked like a rolling wave. It was a testament to the highest form of the craft. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a legacy in waiting, a story waiting to be told. Our story. For years after he died, I couldn't even look at it. The dream was too big, too full of him. But now, looking at the elegant, confident lines of his drafting, I didn't feel sadness. I felt a surge of purpose so powerful it was like a jolt of electricity. My wrinkled hands, the ones that weren't good enough for Megan's brand, traced the lines of the compass rose. I knew what I had to do. I walked to the lumber rack in the back of the workshop, to the section I called the heirloom corner. This was the wood I never touched for commissions. The special stock. My fingers brushed past the cherry and the maple and landed on the stack of black walnut I'd been saving for more than a decade. It was magnificent wood, with a deep, chocolatey grain that swirled like smoke. It was the wood I was saving for a project that mattered. I selected the first perfect, flawless board. Hefting it onto my shoulder, I carried it over to the table saw. It felt right, solid, honest. The next 2 weeks were a strange, secret dance. My days were once again filled with the sounds of my workshop, but the music had changed. The resentful shriek of the saw cutting Megan's oak was replaced by the satisfying, clean slice through the walnut. The work was 10 times more demanding, requiring a level of precision that bordered on obsession, but it didn't feel like a chore. It felt like a prayer. I lived in that workshop. I'd wake up and my first thought would be about the precise angle for an inlay. I'd eat my lunch standing at the bench, my mind lost in the puzzle of a hidden drawer mechanism. The space was once again my sanctuary, filled with the rich, sweet scent of the walnut. David would call, of course. "Hey, Mom, how are the cabinets coming along?" "Making good progress, son," I'd say, my voice even and calm, as I meticulously sanded the edge of a piece for the mariner's chest. "Everything is right on schedule." "Great. Megan is getting so excited. She ordered the new farmhouse sink. It's sitting in a box in our living room just waiting." "That's nice, dear," I'd reply, looking at the emerging compass rose on the lid of the chest, its brass lines gleaming against the dark wood. "Tell her," I said, "that's very nice." I was building something beautiful, something real. I was taking back my time, my skill, and my story, one perfect dovetail joint at a time. They thought I was in that workshop building their dream. And in a way, they were right. I was. I was building my own. Yes, I was building my own dream. But a dream kept locked in a workshop is just a beautiful secret. Frank always said that the final step of any project was to share it. "What's the point of making something beautiful?" he'd ask, "if no one ever gets to see it?" My work on the mariner's chest had become an obsession. The pieces were coming together more beautifully than I had ever imagined. The deep dark walnut felt like silk under my hands, and the brass inlay of the compass rose on the lid caught the light with a soft, warm glow. It was more than a chest. It was the best work I had ever done. It deserved to be seen. Not as a prop, not as content, but as a piece of art. One afternoon, while taking a break and sorting through a pile of mail on the kitchen table, I saw it. A brightly colored postcard, tucked between a water bill and a grocery store flyer. It was the announcement for the Oak Valley Annual Artisan Showcase. It was a tradition in our town, a big juried craft fair held on the village green the third weekend of October. Frank and I used to go every year. We'd even entered a few pieces back in the day, winning a ribbon or two. It was a place for real craftsmen. Potters with clay under their fingernails, glassblowers with calloused hands, weavers who knew their warp from their weft. It was a community of people who, like me, knew the language of raw materials. I hadn't even thought about it in years, but now, looking at the dates on the postcard, a slow smile spread across my face. The showcase was scheduled for the exact same weekend as Megan's photo shoot. The universe, it seemed, had a wonderful sense of irony. I picked up the phone, my heart beating a little faster now, not with anger, but with a thrilling, terrifying sense of purpose. I dialed the number for the event coordinator. A cheerful voice answered. "Oak Valley Cultural Council, this is Brenda." "Hello, Brenda," I said, my voice steady and clear. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm a local woodworker, and I'd like to inquire about entering a piece in the Artisan Showcase this year." There was a pause, and then Brenda's voice warmed with recognition. "Eleanor Vance, of course I know your name. It's been a few years, hasn't it? We'd be honored to have you back. What are you thinking of entering?" I looked across the kitchen, through the open door to the workshop. I could see the mariner's chest sitting proudly in the center of the room, a magnificent silhouette in the afternoon light. "It's a mariner's chest," I said, a note of pride in my voice that I hadn't heard in a long time. "Black walnut with custom brass inlay." "Oh my," Brenda breathed. "That sounds absolutely stunning. Eleanor, the jury deadline has technically passed, but for an artist of your caliber, I'm sure we can make an exception. Consider your spot reserved. We are so thrilled to have you." "Thank you, Brenda," I said. "I'm thrilled to be there." When I hung up the phone, I stood in the quiet of my kitchen for a long moment. A plan is one thing, a secret project, a quiet rebellion that's just for you. But this was different. I had just set a piece of my soul on a collision course with my daughter-in-law's ambition. There was no turning back now. The pieces were on the board, and the game was in motion. One of us was about to get checkmated. The morning of the photo shoot arrived, a perfect, crisp Saturday, the kind of autumn day that photographers dream of, with bright, clear light that streams through windows and makes everything look clean and hopeful. When I pulled up to their house, that light was spilling out of their kitchen, illuminating the chaos within. The front door was wide open. I could see the photographer, Brianna, a woman who looked exactly like her blog, all beige linen and minimalist jewelry, directing an assistant who was moving big, silver light reflectors around. My son, David, was anxiously wiping down an already spotless countertop. And Megan. Megan was the queen bee in the center of the hive, a blur of motion in expensive athleisure wear. Her hair was perfect, her makeup was perfect, her stress was perfect. She was directing everyone, pointing, gesturing, a conductor without an orchestra. The kitchen was beautiful, I had to admit. New stainless steel appliances gleamed. A massive butcher block island stood in the center, waiting to be surrounded by its court of custom cabinetry. The room was a beautiful, empty frame waiting for its masterpiece, waiting for my work. I put my old Ford phone 150 inches park at the curb and took a deep, steadying breath. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel nervous. I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes after the storm has passed and you're left to survey the wreckage. I got out of the truck, the familiar slam of the heavy door echoing in the quiet suburban street. Megan saw me through the window and her face lit up with a mixture of relief and impatience. She rushed out onto the pristine driveway, her hands fluttering. "Eleanor! Thank God!" We were starting to panic. "Brianna is on a very tight schedule. Did you bring them? Are they ready?" She peered into the back of my truck, expecting, I suppose, to see a payload of gleaming finished oak. "Morning, Megan," I said, my voice even. "Yes, everything is ready." I walked to the back of the truck, lowered the tailgate with a familiar metallic groan, and began to unload. I worked methodically, just as I always did. I lifted the first panel, It was a large cabinet door, perfectly square, its edges crisp and clean. I carried it over to the driveway and set it down gently on a moving blanket I'd laid out to protect their pavers. Then I went back for another. And another. David came out of the house, wiping his hands on a towel. "Hey, Mom, let me give you a hand with that." He stopped dead when he saw what I was carrying. He looked at the growing stack on the driveway, then at me, his face a mask of confusion. Megan had gone completely silent beside him, her arms frozen mid-flutter. The panels I was unloading were not the rich, warm, quarter-sawn white oak from her vision board. They were a pale, lifeless beige. They had no grain, no character, no soul. They were flawless, perfectly dimensioned sheets of MDF medium-density fiberboard, the stuff of cheap bookcases and garage shelving. When I had unloaded the last piece, I turned to face them. I stood beside a neat, orderly stack of what amounted to the ghost of their kitchen. Megan finally found her voice. It came out as a choked, disbelieving laugh. "Eleanor, very funny. You almost gave me a heart attack. Okay, where's the real stuff? Is it in the front?" "This is it," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still morning air. "Every piece is cut exactly to the dimensions on your blueprint. The joinery is planned. The holes for the hardware are drilled. It's a perfect build." David took a step forward, touching the edge of one of the doors as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. "Mom, I don't understand," he stammered. "This looks like the stuff Dad used to make shelves for the basement." I didn't look at my son. My eyes were locked on Megan. I saw the progression of emotions on her face, the nervous confusion giving way to dawning horror, and finally, the dark bloom of fury. I saw the moment she understood. "This is a joke," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You've ruined everything. After all your promises, this is what you bring me? This garbage." I finally allowed myself a small, sad smile. I looked from her to the stack of cheap board, and then down at my own two hands, my wrinkled, capable, story-filled hands. "As you said, Megan," I said, and my voice was as cool and sharp as a fresh blade on the table saw. "It's just a hobby. For a rush job with no mention of a budget for materials, I assumed a basic paint-grade fiberboard would be appropriate. It's the standard choice for a quick amateur project." Her own words. Hanging there in the air between us, uglier and more damning than any accusation I could have made. The color drained from her face. I reached back into the cab of my truck and pulled out a clipboard. I walked over and handed it to my stunned, silent son. "Here are the cut lists and the assembly diagrams," I said, my tone crisp and professional. "It's all there. You just need some glue and screws. Now, if you'll both excuse me." I turned my back on them, on the pile of pathetic beige panels, on the wreckage of their perfect story. "I have to get my real work over to the artisan showcase. The judging starts at noon." I didn't wait for a reply. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove away without a single glance in the rearview mirror. The 10-minute drive to the village green felt like a lifetime. It wasn't until I pulled into the crowded parking lot behind the town hall that I allowed myself to breathe. The air was different here. It smelled of autumn, of wood smoke, kettle corn, and damp earth. I could hear the distant sound of a folk band tuning up and the happy chatter of a crowd. This was real. Back on the silent, perfect suburban street, the only sound was the faint hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. Megan stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the pile of lifeless board as if it were a body. Then, a strangled noise escaped her throat. "David, do something!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Call her. Tell her to come back here with the real cabinets right now." David was still holding the clipboard, looking down at my neat, precise diagrams as if they were written in a foreign language. He looked lost. "Meg, I don't think she's coming back." Brianna, the blogger, emerged from the house, a professionally concerned look on her face. "Is everything all right out here? My photographer is asking about the install." She saw the stack of MDF and her polite smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "It's a slight delay," Megan said, her voice a high-pitched, frantic performance. "A little mix-up with the materials. My mother-in-law is just so funny. A real character. She'll be right back with the actual oak. We can start with some detail shots of the sink." Brianna looked from Megan's panicked face to David's pale one. She was a professional who built her career on reading vibes, and the vibes in that driveway were catastrophic. She walked over and touched the edge of one of the MDF doors with a single, perfectly manicured finger. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The cheap, porous material spoke for itself. At the Oak Valley Artisan Showcase, I had help unloading. 2 older gentlemen, fellow woodworkers I'd known for years, saw me wrestling the heavy mariner's chest out of my truck and rushed over. "Eleanor Vance, by God, is that walnut?" One of them, a man named George, exclaimed, running a reverent hand over the polished lid. "It is," I smiled. "That's a masterpiece, Eleanor. An absolute masterpiece," the other one said, peering closely at the brass inlay of the compass rose. "The joinery is invisible. Here, my work wasn't content, it was craftsmanship. Here, my wrinkled hands were shaken with respect." I set up my display in the small tent I'd been assigned. I didn't need much. I draped a simple black cloth over a table and placed the chest on top of it. It didn't need staging or a clever backstory. It told its own story, in the silent, eloquent language of wood and brass and time. Back in the kitchen, the photo shoot was dying a slow, awkward death. They had tried. They shot the gleaming faucet. They shot the subway tile backsplash, but the gaping, toothless holes where the cabinets should have been were impossible to ignore. Megan, desperate, had David start assembling one of the MDF pantry units. The result was worse than the empty space. It looked like something you'd find in a college dorm room, flimsy and sad, its pale, unfinished surface sucking the life and light out of the expensive room. Brianna finally put her phone away. She walked over to Megan, her expression no longer concerned, but professionally flat. It was the look of someone cutting their losses. "Megan," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I think we're going to have to reschedule this." "No, we can make it work," Megan pleaded. "We'll paint them. David can paint them right now." Brianna gave a small, pitying shake of her head. "Our brand is about authenticity. This isn't it. We'll be in touch." She turned to her assistant. "Let's pack it up." The dream wasn't just deferred, it was dead, and its cheap fiberboard coffin was sitting in the middle of her perfect, empty kitchen. The judges arrived at my tent just after 1 o'clock. There were 3 of them: a curator from a local museum, a professor of furniture design from the State University, and a master craftsman whose work I had admired for 50 years. They didn't speak at first. They simply walked around the mariner's chest, their eyes taking in every detail. The professor ran his fingers over the dovetail joints, a look of deep appreciation on his face. The curator leaned in to examine the intricate brass work. Finally, the master craftsman, a man with hands even more wrinkled than my own, looked at me. "This is the work of a lifetime, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a large, pleated ribbon. It was a brilliant royal blue, with the words "Best in Show" printed on it in gold foil. He carefully pinned it to the black cloth right in front of the chest. A small crowd that had gathered around the tent broke into spontaneous, heartfelt applause. I stood there, under the warm autumn sun, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the sound of genuine admiration, and I just smiled. My hands, my wrinkled, story-filled, wonderfully capable hands, felt perfectly at home. I packed up the chest carefully that evening, wrapping it in soft, moving blankets like a sleeping child. The blue ribbon and the prize check for $5,000 were tucked safely in my purse. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the engine and the sound of my own steady breathing. Back in the workshop, I unwrapped the chest and placed it back in the center of the room. It seemed to glow in the soft light of the single overhead lamp. I took out a clean, soft cloth and a can of lemon oil and began to apply a final, loving coat. The rhythmic motion of my hand, back and forth, was a kind of meditation. I wasn't celebrating, I wasn't gloating, I was just peaceful. For the first time in weeks, the air in the workshop felt clean. It felt like mine again. I was so lost in the work that I didn't hear him arrive. It was a soft scrape of a shoe on the concrete that made me look up. David was standing in the open doorway, a silhouette against the dark blue of the evening sky. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. I didn't say anything either. I simply turned back to my work, my hand continuing its slow, circular polishing. The soft shush of the cloth on the wood was the only sound between us. I was not going to make this easy for him. The silence was his to fill. He walked in slowly, hesitantly, like a stranger entering a sacred place. His eyes scanned the workshop, lingering on the tools hanging in their perfect order on the wall, on the neat stacks of lumber. It was as if he were seeing it all for the first time, not as Mom's messy garage, but as what it was, the domain of a master craftsman. His gaze finally landed on the mariner's chest. He walked toward it, his steps slow. He saw the blue ribbon, pinned to a post on the workbench, and the prize check I had propped up next to it. He didn't touch the chest. He just stood there, looking at it, his head bowed. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I could hear the crickets starting their nightly chorus outside. Then he took a deep breath, a long, shuddering intake of air. "I smelled the walnut shavings when I got out of the car," he said, his voice raspy, thick with an emotion I couldn't place. And for just a second, I thought Dad was still here. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a pain so deep it was startling. "He would be so proud of that chest," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "He would have spent an hour just looking at the joints." He shook his head slowly, a look of profound self-disgust on his face. "And he would be so ashamed of me." I stopped polishing. I set the cloth down on the workbench. I waited. "I let you both down, Mom," he whispered, the words seeming to tear their way out of him. "What she said, what I let her say, what I let you become to us. You weren't my mother anymore. You were just a resource, someone to solve our problems. I stood by and I let it happen because it was easier than standing up to my own wife. It was easier than being a good son." He looked down at his own hands, soft and clean from his life behind a desk. "Dad taught me how to hold a hammer. He taught me the difference between a rip cut and a cross cut. He taught me to respect the work. And I forgot. I forgot it all." The apology was finally real. It wasn't about the ruined photo shoot or the empty kitchen. It was about the real crime, the slow, careless erosion of respect, of love, of family. "I am so sorry, Mom," he said, and this time the tears he'd been holding back finally fell. "I am so sorry." I picked up the soft cloth again. I looked from my son's tear-streaked face to the magnificent chest my husband had dreamed of and my hands had built. The story wasn't over, but a chapter, a very painful chapter, had finally come to a close. But a story doesn't end just because one person apologizes. Forgiveness isn't a single event. It's a foundation you have to rebuild, board by board. A week later, they were sitting at my kitchen table. It was the same table where David had done his homework as a boy, the same table where I'd planned his birthday parties and holiday dinners. But the dynamic was entirely different. They hadn't invited themselves over. I had called them. Megan was a ghost of her former self. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a plain sweater, with no makeup. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the salt shaker as if it held the secrets to the universe. She hadn't said a word since she'd walked in the door. David sat beside her, a quiet, nervous energy radiating from him. He was the reason she was here. I knew it, and he knew it. I poured them each a cup of coffee, my movements deliberate and unhurried. I was no longer a servant in my own home. I was the one setting the terms. I sat down in my usual chair at the head of the table and took a slow sip from my mug. After a long, uncomfortable silence, I placed my mug down and reached for a simple, professional-looking folder I'd set on the counter. It was the kind of folder a contractor would use. I slid it across the polished wood of the table until it stopped directly in front of them. Megan flinched, as if the folder were hot. David looked at it, then at me, his expression questioning. "Go ahead," I said, my voice calm. "Open it." He reached out and pulled the folder toward him. Megan leaned in, her eyes wide with a mixture of dread and curiosity. He opened the cover. Inside, on top, was a single professionally printed page. It was a formal quote. At the top, in clean, bold letters, it said, "Vance Woodworking, Kitchen Cabinetry Proposal." Below was a detailed itemized list: quarter sawn white oak, materials cost; custom panel doors, labor; dovetail drawer boxes, labor; pantry units, island paneling, crown molding. Every single element from her vision board was there, broken down with a cold, hard number next to it. And at the very bottom of the page, in bold, was the grand total: $22,000. I watched as Megan's eyes scanned down the page, her breath catching when she hit that final number. It was the exact number she had bragged about saving, the exact price of my dignity. David just stared at it, his face pale. He finally lifted his eyes to mine. "Mom," he started, but his voice trailed off. "I would be happy to build your kitchen," I said, my tone polite and businesslike. "It's a beautiful design, and I would be proud to put my name on it, done the right way." I let that sink in. Then I gestured to the bottom of the quote. "You'll also see the estimated completion date." They both looked down again. Next to the total, it read, "Estimated completion, Spring, 2026. Megan made a small, wounded sound. 2 years. An eternity in the world of an influencer with a deadline. "I've decided to take on a few commissions," I continued, reaching for a simple, leather-bound ledger book that was sitting next to the folder. I opened it. The pages were already filling up with names and project details, written in my neat, steady hand. "That fellow George from the showcase? He wants a rocking chair for his first grandchild. Brenda from the Cultural Council commissioned a set of bookshelves for the new library wing. The prize money was nice, but the waiting list is even better." I turned the book around so they could see the list of names, the deposits paid, the schedule of work stretching out for the next 18 months. This wasn't a punishment. This was a fact. My time, my skill, my hobby, was now a commodity, a valuable one. "If you'd like to proceed," I said, closing the ledger and pushing a pen toward them, "I'll require a 50% deposit for the materials, and then you'll be added to my client list." I leaned back in my chair and took another sip of coffee. The power in that room had shifted so completely it was almost a physical presence. I wasn't the sweet old mom who could be counted on for a favor. I was Eleanor Vance, of Vance Woodworking, and my services were in high demand. David looked at Megan. He was waiting for her to explode, to protest, to argue, but she didn't. She just stared at the quote, at the impossible price, and the even more impossible timeline. She was looking at the real cost of what she had done. Finally, she lifted her head and looked at me. For the first time, her eyes weren't filled with ambition or calculation. They were just empty. And in that emptiness, there was a tiny, flickering spark of something I had never seen before: respect. "Okay," she whispered. The word was barely audible. "Okay."